on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of The Stew on this podcast. I hope that you had a great weekend, and hopefully you are super excited for this upcoming week. And there's always something to be excited about, and I hope you know that. Hey, I wanted to come at you today with an episode just talking really about, you probably even saw it in the title of this episode. It's just called Embracing the Suck. Which is awesome. It's an awesome title for an episode, and it's super enticing. And it's also a phrase that I use a lot. I don't remember where I heard it from for the first time, but really the idea of embracing the suck is, dude, we know that suckiness just is part of life. Life throws things at us that we weren't prepared for, that we weren't expecting. And we just find ourselves in those moments. At the end of it, we just kind of look back and go, man, that sucked. And so really this whole episode is just kind of talking about that, and really the mentality that we all have. There's three different types of mentality that many of us go through, or we have, when it comes to when trials hit our lives, when those unexpected moments hit. But yeah, stuff happens, and we all know this, whether that is a financial crisis or a health scare or what have you. Life throws stuff at us that we just weren't prepared for, and then we have to come up with how we are going to respond in those situations. And the reality is, we can't control what it is that happens to us, especially when it's like the unexpected kind of stuff that happens. We can't control that, but what we can control is how we respond to situations like that come our way. And really those three type of responses fall into these categories. You can either be optimistic about what is happening or you can be pessimistic about what is going on in that situation, or you can be realistic about what's going on. And my guess is that you already know which one that you are, either because you're super clear on how you respond to stuff like that, or people have told you, and they've affirmed it in you. And what I mean by that is, you'll hear people say, you always, or you often fill in the blank. So, if something unexpected happened and everybody else is freaking out around you and you're an optimistic type of individual, you'll probably hear people say, you always see the brighter side of things. You see the silver lining in the clouds. If you're a pessimistic type of individual, when some kind of pushback in life comes your way, your typical response is usually going to be, the sky is falling, the world is coming to an end. And you probably heard people say to you in those situations, like, why do you always see the negative side of things? And then if you're a realistic individual, when those pushbacks, those trials, those unexpected things pop up, you've probably felt, and you've probably heard people say, man, you're kind of steady in this. Like, you don't freak out one way or the other. You're not necessarily looking for the good in the situation, nor are you really seeing things like the world is coming to an end just because of a certain event. So my understanding and my expectation is that you probably already know which one that you are. My question for you to wrestle through is, based off of what response you have, is that a healthy response? Is it a healthy response to be optimistic when something tragic comes your way or something unexpected comes your way? Is it a healthy response to be pessimistic? Like, you stubbed your toe and you're probably thinking you're going to have to be in a walking boot for 6 months because you probably shattered every bone in your foot just because you stubbed that toe on the corner table. And is it a healthy response to just be a realist and just be in the situation? So there's a podcast that I listen to that I really gleaned a lot from. And one of the co-hosts in that podcast, they really talk about this mentality a lot. And I love the example that they give in there. They actually use the example of prisoners of war, right? Many of us will have no idea uh, what that kind of scenario will look like for us. Many of us were never going to be prisoners of war. But they try to paint the picture for us of how these responses go into play, especially for the person who would be a prisoner of war. And so they say, the optimistic individual who is a prisoner of war, they're the type of person that sits there and says, man, this is a sucky situation that I don't want to be in. But my expectation is, my mentality is that we'll be out of this, let's say, come Christmas time. So let's say that it's summer, they're prisoners of war, they're in prison. So the optimistic person says, we'll get out soon. The pessimistic individual will sit there and say, no, we're probably going to be in here for the rest of our lives, and we're probably going to die in here. And so they just kind of give up all hope. So you got the optimistic individual that's holding on to this major hope that they're only going to be in that situation for a short amount of time. And then you've got the pessimistic individual that says, life has come to an end. This is probably where my life will come to an end. And then you've got the realistic individual, and they say that's the type of person that, as a prisoner of war, just kind of is in that situation and goes, okay, we are in a sucky situation, so let's see how this one goes. And so they advocate for the fact that probably the healthier of those mindsets is the realistic individual. And here's the reason why. They say for the person who tends to walk down the optimist lane, they say, so what happens when Christmas rolls around and you're still a prisoner of war? You could keep prolonging that expectation of when you're going to get out. And when that marker comes and your expectation hasn't become a reality, then the optimistic side is actually slowly killing you. And as I share this, I'm pretty sure they said this was a proven thing for it was probably like the Vietnam War or the Korean War, something along those lines. But they talked about how the people who were optimistic as a prisoner of war were the ones that actually died off the quickest, just because they had this expectation: I'm going to be home by Christmas, I'm going to be home by Easter, I'm going to be home by 4th of July. And as each of those dates came around and they were still in prison, they lost more and more hope of survival. For the pessimistic individual, it showed that because they gave up so soon, that they also, their expectation of life just declined rapidly because they saw no hope in the situation that they were in. Whereas the realistic individual, because they are facing what they're facing, they've fully come to, they've fully grasped the severity of their situation. They actually are the ones who survived because they didn't have this expectation that things were going to get better, and they didn't have this expectation that this was going to be the best. They were just taking things one day at a time and just seeing how it goes. And also in this podcast, I love what they talk about. They share this story as really this idea about a farmer who is faced with different situations. And so they talk about how, one day this farmer rancher, his son comes to him. They own like a horse farm. The son comes to him and the son says to the dad, like, Dad, I messed up. I left the gate open and all of our horses have escaped. And so the friends come rallying around this family and they're saying to this farmer, like, man, this sucks that you lost like all of your horses. And instead of the farmer wallowing in the situation, his response is, we'll see. We'll see if this is a sucky situation or not. Well, after some given time, all of the horses come back. And as the horses come back, they also bring along with them some like wild Mustangs that they kind of grouped up with. So the farm actually grew because of that. And so the same friends that come rallying around, they're like, oh man, your horses came back, and they brought even more horses along with them. Like, man, this is such a good thing. Like, way to go. Like, man, God must be on your side. And the farmer says, we'll see. And so the story continues, and that same son who accidentally left the gate open and all the horses left, that same son is working on breaking the new Mustangs that came in and breaking them and working them into submission. And as he's doing it, he gets bucked off the horse, off of one of the horses, and he breaks his leg. And the friends come running around and they say, "Man, this sucks. Your son broke his leg. You won't have him to help you." And the farmer says, "We'll see." Well, then war breaks out, and because they're going around from town to town. The government's going around town to town saying, "Hey, we need your young sons in order to enlist and fight in this war." But because the son broke his leg, the son ends up not going to war. And again, the friends are like, "Man, how lucky is it that your son broke his leg, and so now he doesn't have to go fight in this major war?" And again, the farmer says, "We'll see." And so the story continues on, and the farmer in the story, he just stays steady in the fact that we'll see, because every situation that comes our way, really, it could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. The reality is that we don't have the foresight knowledge to know how that's going to work out. And many of us, we've probably faced those moments in our lives that when we're smack dab in the middle of it, we're like, dude, this is the worst thing that has ever happened. Like, there's no hope at the end of this. We're going to lose our house. We're going to XYZ. But then hindsight being 2020, you look back on those situations and you're super thankful for what you went through, and you see the blessings on the other side that came from it. Because we don't know in the situation whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And so that's why I would advocate, and this is where the title of this episode comes into play, just embrace the suck. And we know that life is hard. We all have our own different stories of facing some kind of hardship or trial. But because we don't know how that story is going to end when we do come up against something like that, I would advocate for just embrace the suck. Maybe not be super optimistic. Like, it's okay to be optimistic sometimes, but don't be super optimistic in your trial, because it could leave you feeling completely disgruntled and discouraged at the end of it, because things don't work out the way that you were expecting it to. And for like a follower of Jesus, like if I were to put a Christian spin on this, when things don't work out the way that you expect it to, because it wasn't part of your plan, but it was part of God's plan, man, that can leave you feeling like that God's not on your side, which isn't the case at all. Scripture says that we have a God who is for us and not against us. But our enemy, Satan, would love to just whisper into the optimist's ears and just say in those hard times, see, your God is not on your side, or your God is not real. You can't trust him. It's the same thing that Satan did in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. When he said to Eve, like, look, you're not going to die. All right. What God's doing is he doesn't want you to be like him, because what God knows is once you take a bite of that fruit, you'll become like God. So Satan is planting in this idea of deception that God is not for us. He wasn't for Adam and Eve, that he was actually against something better for them. And so when we face trials in this life as followers of Jesus, it is so easy for Satan to come in and say, see, I told you God wasn't on your side, and I told you that you can't trust him. So sometimes in those sucky situations, it is not a good thing to be an optimist, because Satan will take advantage of that. In the same way, sometimes it's not going to work out in your favor to be a pessimist. We are promised trials and tribulations in this life. Again, if you go back to the Garden of Eden, what we know is that this life is a broken, fractured image of what God originally had in mind. When he created everything, he said that it was very good. And then disobedience brings along sin, or the sin from disobedience shatters God's goodness of this life that we were supposed to experience, and then ushers in depression and cancer and all the other illnesses and viruses and racial tension and all that kind of stuff. So we don't live in the world as God intended for it to be. And because of that, we feel the trials of this life. And as the pessimistic individual, it's so easy to sit there and say that this life sucks and it's never going to get better than this. But again, you dive into scripture and what you see is, man, it does get better than this. That what we face on this earth, man, it's merely for a brief moment in time, but eternity is ahead of us for those who have placed our hope in Jesus. So we hold on to Jesus with white knuckle intensity, so we have a little bit more optimism moving forward and less pessimism. So we have that hope to hold on to. But again, Satan will use those trials and tribulations as the opportunity to sit there and say, there is no best is yet to come. This is the best is going to be. And when he's able to plant that seed into our minds, that's where you see people diving into drugs or alcohol or sex or money or whatever, some kind of vice that helps fill that void, because this is the best. It doesn't get better than this, so I might as well just experience what there is now. So Satan loves to take advantage of the optimistic-minded individual. And he also loves to exploit the pessimistic individual. And that's why I say, man, just embrace the suck. Like, we have to remember that we serve a God as Jesus followers who is not foreign to the idea of trials, right? He's not foreign to the idea of temptations. Jesus himself went through his own temptations. One of my favorite pictures in scripture is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, because it was in that moment where Jesus had the opportunity to decide whether or not he wanted to go through with the action of taking the cross and dying. So the atoning for everybody's sin, dying on the cross. Like, Jesus made that decision. He had a choice, and he chose for the world. He chose you and me over his own comfort and his own survival, which is great. It makes him the greatest hero of all time. He put the needs of everybody else above his own. But Jesus embraced the suck in that moment, knowing what was coming his way. And sometimes that's what we need to do, is that we need to embrace the suck, knowing that this life that we're living, man, it is just temporary. And to be honest with you, those sucky moments that we face in this life, man, they're temporary as well. And it might seem like a massive mountain that we're facing at that moment. But really, if we're honest, how many times have we faced a mountain before us that when we were on the other side of it, it was more like a speed bump than it was a mountain? And how many times, once we've gotten on the other side of that situation, do we look back on it and say, you know, I'm actually really grateful that I went through that, because one, it has provided a great story. Two, because I relied on King Jesus in that moment, he has proven himself to be faithful and true. But three, once you're able to climb a mountain, you then get to become a Sherpa that helps other people who are going through situations like that to make it to the mountaintop and experience the fullness of God and who he is in those situations, showing off that, man, he is right there with you through it all. And then make it back down and notice that maybe the mountain wasn't as big as it was. So my encouragement for you is embrace the suck. I understand. I get it. Sometimes that suckiness is like the biggest heap of suckiness that life can throw at you. But I would encourage you, just embrace it. Rally people around you, have community of people around you that can be in your corner when you're facing those situations, and then hold on to King Jesus with white knuckle intensity, because I promise you, it's going to eventually come to an end. And God has a plan and a purpose for that pain, for that trial, for that suckiness. And I would also encourage you, look back to all the other times that you've faced trials like that, and ask yourself, man, where did God show up in this situation? Because if he showed up then, guaranteed he's going to show up this time in this suckiness. So embrace it. Know that God is not unaware of the suckiness of this life. Know that for God, this was never the intention for this life, but what he intended is what is ahead of us for eternity. So I hope that's encouraging for you as you head off into this week, that idea of just embracing the suck, because the reality is, I don't know what is coming your way this week. right? You don't know what's coming your way this week. You might have the best week ever, or this might end up being the worst week ever. But I always say, hold on to that mentality of the farmer. I don't know. It could be the best week. It could be the worst week. I don't know. I guess we'll wait and see. But hold on to the one who is faithful and true through it all. Hold on to Jesus. And what would it matter at that point? He's got your back. If he is for you, then who could be against you? So, hey, thanks for listening to this episode of the Stew on This podcast. If I could be of any assistance to you in any way, like if you're facing a hard situation, I'd love to be able to just pray for you. So please reach out and just let me be that person in your corner. I would love for that. If this podcast is a blessing to you, please be sure to subscribe to it so you never miss an episode of the Stew on This podcast. Also, leave a rating and a review. That's what helps get this out to more people. They can find it and hopefully find a little bit of encouragement as well. And if you're somebody who maybe you haven't started that journey yet of journeying with Jesus, but you want to know more, please reach out. I would love to have that conversation with you as well because, man, I think Jesus is awesome. And I think that if you give him the shot, you'll find out that he's pretty awesome as well and bring maybe a little bit more clarity to the situations that you and I face in life. So have a great week. I will see you next week for another episode of the Stew on This podcast. But until then, be blessed. Bye.